Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into a world of flickering candlelight, ancient wooden bed frames, and the heavy scent of burning tallow. The kind of place where shadows stretch long over stone walls, and secrets fester in linen sheets. You're not in a fairy tale castle. Not really. You're in the real medieval Europe. And the truth is, it's awkward, sweaty, deeply religious and, frankly, weirder than you expect. You lie back, feeling the weight of itchy wool blankets on your skin. Outside the window, someone's chamber pot splashes into the gutter. Inside, a married couple lies apart, hands folded in prayer, begging not for pleasure but forgiveness. Because here, sex isn't just a biological act. It's a moral event, a spiritual danger, a whispered negotiation between flesh and fire. And you, dear listener, are about to walk a tightrope across both. You probably won't survive this, emotionally speaking. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're tuning in from, and what time it is right now. I always love seeing who's drifting off with me around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a dim stone, chapel-thick walls, musty incense, and cold pews carved by tired hands. A priest drones Latin phrases above your head. You're not religious, but you catch something about lust, carnalis concupiscentiae, the carnal desire. According to medieval doctrine, it's not just frowned upon, it's the source of humanity's fall. Original sin. Eve's apple, the root of suffering. You shift in your seat. Is that why everyone looks so nervous? Because in this world, sex isn't private. It's surveilled, controlled, measured in sign. The church has literally written manual stick, detailed treatises listing every permissible position. Spoiler, it's one. And every forbidden one basically. All the others. Sex, even between married couples, is supposed to be for procreation only. Pleasure, suspicious, kissing, risky, and don't even think about Sundays, feast days, Lent, or Advent. Those are strictly off limits, and yet, humans are humans. You pass by a confessional, and overhear whispers. A woman crying softly. A man confessing he lingered too long with his wife after dark. The priest's sigh is louder than his words. You hear penance assigned, 3 Hail Marys, and abstain for a week. Again. Historians still argue whether this spiritual policing was enforced equally. Nobles had more leeway, especially when royal bloodlines were at stake. But for peasants and townsfolk, sex was both omnipresent and strictly judged. A paradox, really. Because while it was everywhere, etched into church carvings, gossiped about in markets, joked about in folk songs, it was also laced with fear. You walk through a marketplace and see a row of tiny dolls hung on string. Fertility charms. Women whisper prayers into them before slipping them into the folds of their skirts. The church disapproves, of course, but sometimes desperation outweighs doctrine. A man offers you a sip of ale and chuckles. My boy's named after the bishop, he says. We figured that might bless the next one into being. You raise your eyebrows, but he just grins. In a world without reliable medicine or birth control, superstition often feels safer than silence. There's a deeper hypocrisy, too. You enter a noble household and notice a thick tapestry. At first glance, it's a hunting scene. But the longer you look, the more suggestive the poses become. A spear thrust, a stag's open mouth, a woman watching with parted lips. Symbolism layered under decor. Art historians still debate whether these images were intentional innuendo, or just our modern minds reading too much into medieval embroidery. You run your fingers across the edge of a bed, massive curtained, and shared not just by couples, but often by children, servants, and sometimes guests. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. And yet, that didn't stop anyone. Love found its way between creaking floorboards and midnight whispers. You overhear two washerwomen gossiping by the river. One mentions a midwife who's visited the blacksmith's wife 3 times this month. The other raises her eyebrows. That girl's belly won't stay flat much longer, she says, wringing out a tunic with a little too much force. Even here, in the open air, sex hovers, unspoken, yet always implied. One particularly strange fact: medieval people believed that conception required mutual orgasm. Yes, really. The theory came from Galen, a Greek physician whose medical texts dominated for centuries. According to his view, both the man and the woman had to emit seed, so if a woman got pregnant, the assumption was she must have enjoyed it. A dangerous idea, especially in cases of coercion. It blurred the lines between consent and biology in troubling ways. And yet, knowledge was slippery. You watch a group of students argue beneath a cloister arch. One swears by Galen. Another has just returned from Salerno and claims Aristotle was right. It's the man alone who plants life. A third mutters something about a homunculus, a tiny preformed human inside every sperm. You blink. That's not real, right? And yet, in some illuminated manuscripts, you can spot little people drawn inside seed drops. It's hilarious and horrifying. The air grows heavier as night falls. You head back toward your imagined chamber and picture what it must have been, like living in a world where desire was suspect, but marriage required intimacy, where love was tangled with law, and every kiss could lead to confession. And yet, despite the fear, the guilt, the preaching, and the punishments, people kept touching. They kept sneaking glances. They made up stories, wrote naughty poems, carved suggestive graffiti into church pews. Because the truth is, the human body doesn't always listen to doctrine, and neither does the heart. You lie back now, eyes fluttering, closed, and you imagine candlelight flickering on stone, the rustle of linen, a world both stricter and softer than yours, and deep beneath the rules desire, fragile and unkillable, burning just as brightly. Just don't tell the priest. You're standing at the edge of a small village square, boots thick with mud. As a crowd gathers quiet, tense, expectant. At the center is a girl, pale-faced, not more than 16. She's holding her hands together like she's praying, but you know it's not God she fears right now. It's the women behind her, the midwives, and the bishop watching closely from the side. This isn't a wedding, it's a virginity trial. You've heard the rumors, of course, that girls were examined before marriage to make sure they were pure, that the honor of entire families and, sometimes entire alliances, rested on a scrap of tissue. You always assumed it was exaggerated. It's not. 2 women approach the girl with practiced, somber faces. The crowd parts slightly, making space. The bishop nods once, then looks away. You follow the procession into a side room of the church, stone-walled, candlelit, smelling of lavender and anxiety. The girl lies down. The women lift her skirts. She flinches. You turn away, and yes, it happens. They check for what they call intactness, the presence of a hymen, though medieval understanding of anatomy is spotty at best. Some think it's a literal seal. Others believe in magical signs: tightness, coldness, even the blush of innocence. There are no real medical standards, just folk wisdom and religious pressure. Historians still argue whether these inspections were widespread or isolated. Some believe they were mostly ceremonial, used to shame or control young women in noble families. Others think they were far more common, especially in disputes over dowries, inheritance, or legitimacy. Either way, the message was clear: your body is not yours. It's a certificate, a contract, a symbol of your family's worth. The girl passes, sort of. One midwife nods, the other looks uncertain. The bishop clears his throat and declares her fit for marriage. The girl doesn't smile. She just pulls her skirt down slowly and walks back to the square where her betrothed is waiting looking mildly bored, as if he's just checked the weather. You feel a chill. You follow them through their wedding feast, a noisy affair with spilling ale and roasted geese. There's laughter now, but you can't forget what just happened. Later, after the music fades, the guests will wait again for a second proof. This time, it's the bedsheet. It's customary in many parts of Italy, even England, for a servant or family member to inspect the marital bed after consummation. They're looking for blood, physical evidence that virginity was lost. Sometimes the sheets are even paraded through the streets, or hung outside the house like a crimson banner of honor. You wonder how many girls faked it. The answer? Quite a few. There were tricks pricking a finger, smearing pigeon's blood, using specially prepared cloths. Some midwives even sold kits, a little pouch of powder and dye, to be crushed into the linen at just the right moment. You marvel at the cunning, the quiet rebellion beneath the surface of all that control. And yet, for some, the pressure was too much. You visit a graveyard later that night and notice how many headstones belong to girls under 20. Some died in childbirth, others by suicide. One has a crude carving, just a rose, drooping, in the year 1329. No name, no blessing. You sit beside it and wonder what story lies buried there. A strange fact you can't stop thinking about. In some areas of Eastern Europe, virginity wasn't just assumed, was tested by community consensus. You hear whispers of customs, where older women would guard the bride's bedchamber, listening for sounds of struggle or satisfaction. It's deeply invasive, and somehow even more awkward than the inspection. You walk away, heart heavy. Back in the village, the newlyweds sit at breakfast. The girl is quiet, eyes lowered. Her husband laughs with his friends. They're recounting the events with theatrical bravado, mimicking her voice, bragging about breaking in a wild mare. No one corrects them. She just sips her broth, cheeks burning. You think about how different it is now, and how the myth of virginity, the obsession with purity, the idea that a woman's value is tied to what has or hasn't happened to her body, those echoes still ring. Modern in tone, medieval in spirit, the language has changed. The fear hasn't. You shift your weight and look back toward the chapel. It's quiet now, empty, except for a faint trail of wax on the floor where the candles dripped. You follow it. It leads you to a side altar, a statue of the Virgin Mary, carved in soft stone, hands folded, gaze serene. She's everywhere in this world, the ideal woman, chaste, obedient, beautiful, untouched. The model girls are told to emulate, and yet, she's also a mother. Which means, as the more curious theologians sometimes ask, how? Some whispered it was divine insemination. Others argued it was metaphorical. Still others just avoided the question altogether, because if you start pulling at those theological threads, the whole tapestry starts to unravel, and no one wants that. You trace your fingers along the base of the statue. Someone scratched a name there. Anne, faint, probably a girl, probably hoping Mary was listening. You step back outside. The village is asleep now. The house is shuttered, the fire pit's cooling under a slow blanket of stars. You can still smell the goose grease from the feast. You can still feel the fear from that girl's eyes. It's a strange world you've wandered into, one where the most private parts of a person's body were public domain, where virginity wasn't just a personal experience, it was a performance, a political act, a form of currency, and beneath all that lace and linen, just a scared young human being, hoping not to bleed too much, hoping to survive. You tuck yourself under your covers now, safe and warm, centuries away from all this, but with a sharper awareness of what your ancestors endured and what some still do. You close your eyes, and the candlelight flickers once more. You're standing in the shadowed hallway of a nobleman's manor, peering at something strange displayed on the wall, a rusted, curved apparatus, locked behind glass, shaped like a pair of iron underwear. At first it looks like some sort of armor. Then your brain catches up. Oh, you've heard of these chastity belts, supposedly used to keep women pure while their husbands went off to war. Ironclad loyalty, quite literally. But the deeper truth, much murkier. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were ever genuinely used in the Middle Ages or if they're mostly a myth that spiraled out of control. You lean in, examining the rivets and locks. It looks clunky, painful, impractical for, well, existing. You imagine walking, let alone sitting. There's no soft lining, no hinges, and definitely no sense of hygiene. Some claim the belts were more symbolic than functional jokes, warnings, even satirical gifts. Others insist they were real tools of control, especially for noble daughters, whose value rested entirely on marriage prospects. A few surviving examples exist, most dating from the Renaissance, not the actual medieval period, which raises questions. One curious detail: many of the earliest known chastity belts were too small to be worn by adult women. Some fit children. That's unsettling. Were they made for display? To frighten? To send a message? You step back. Whatever their origin, the idea alone says plenty about medieval attitudes toward women's bodies. That they were dangerous, that they needed to be locked away, that lust was a lurking enemy, and that the responsibility to guard virtue always fell on the female half. You make your way upstairs, past faded tapestries and stiff velvet chairs, until you reach a chamber once belonging to a nobleman's wife. On the bedpost hangs a small iron key, not part of the original decor, surely, but someone placed it there later, as part of the myth. The key to control, the key to suspicion. You lie down on the bed, the mattress stuffed with straw and lumpy feathers. You imagine being locked into a belt like that, day after day. No freedom, no autonomy, just metal and message. You try to shift, and even in your imagination, it pinches, it burns, it bruises. Yet here's the thing, women weren't always passive in this story. You roll over and find a hidden drawer in the bed frame. Inside, a pair of shears. Old, rusty, worn by time, but sharp enough once. It makes you wonder how many locked girls found ways to free themselves. How many keys were stolen. How many belts were fake swapped out at night, worn only in public. Presented like trophies of obedience, while desire lived underground. A fringe fact, some 15th century Italian poems mention chastity belts, but in jest. One even describes a woman slipping out of hers with help from a maid and a bit of olive oil. Another mentions a locksmith called Virgin's Doom. Clearly, the idea was floating around, but not always as serious business. Still, the image stuck. You descend into the manor's library and pull out a dusty tome, an old medical manual, filled with illustrations, some grotesque, some hilarious. And there it is, in the margins, a drawing of a chastity belt, complete with absurd spikes and dramatic locking mechanisms. You tilt your head. It looks more like something from a comic book than a functional device. And yet, Victorian collectors in the 19th century loved this idea. They dug up these supposed belts, displayed them in museums, even gifted replicas to each other. They romanticized the medieval world as dark, brutal, and deeply repressed, which helped justify their own uncomfortable morals. Ironically, the chastity belt myth exploded during a time when they were afraid of female sexuality, too. So maybe the real belt wasn't made of metal. Maybe it was made of story. Still, in some corners of medieval society, symbolic locking did exist. You overhear a noblewoman boasting that her virtue was guarded by angels and gates. A poetic way of saying, off-limits. Cloistered. You're reminded of how some women took vows of celibacy not because they loved God, but because they hated. The alternatives: forced marriage, childbirth, loss of freedom. You wander through a convent garden and see them women who locked their desires away, not with iron, but with scripture and solitude. And yet, even here, rumors whisper. The abbess, with a secret lover. The novice who disappeared one night and returned with a red scarf and a guilty smile. Human nature never fully fits inside chains. Another odd belief. Some thought that sexual restraint made a man stronger, that avoiding women conserved essence. You hear a knight grumble, iron below the belt, steel in the arm. It's all tied together. Chastity, masculinity, domination, and of course, underneath it all, fear. Because what if the belt didn't hold? What if the girl outsmarted the lock? What if desire, like water, always found the cracks? You're back in the hallway now, staring again at that display case. The chastity belt gleams under soft torchlight, polished for tourists. You assume. It's absurd, and a little tragic. Not because it was worn, but because the idea of it lingered. Long after the Middle Ages ended, the symbol endured. In jokes, in art, in horror films, a weaponized undergarment. A metaphor turned museum piece. And yet, you can't help but notice it. Always her who wears it. Never him. You whisper that observation aloud, just to yourself, and the silence seems to nod back in agreement. Now, beneath your blanket, you shift slightly. Let your muscles relax. Let your breath soften. Because while some stories clang with iron and shame, others fade gently into sleep. And you're safe. For now, you wake to the sound of distant chanting low, rhythmic, echoing through stone. You're in a monastery now. Cold floors, dim corridors, scrolls stacked high in narrow alcoves. It smells like old wax, parchment, and something distinctly human beneath all that piety. You pad quietly past a row of silent monks bowed in prayer. But your footsteps lead you not to the chapel, but to the scriptorium. This is where books are born. Ink, quills, the soft rasp of parchment being turned. At first glance, everything looks orderly. Celibate men, copying sacred texts, under divine silence. But look closer. That flick of a smile between two scribes. That flushed cheek. That hand lingering too long on the spine of a fellow brother's psalter. Monks behaving badly. Who'd have thought? You pull a volume off a shelf and open it. The front page is standard enough. Psalterium, neatly inscribed. But halfway through, the margins begin to shift. Small drawings, barely noticeable, unless you're looking. A nun lifting her skirts. A monkey fondling a priest. Two men kissing behind a vine. You blink. Is that a phallus chasing a man? It is, and it has legs. Welcome to the weird world of marginalia. Historians still debate the intent behind these odd illustrations. Were they jokes, satire, secret rebellion, or simply the result of bored monks trapped in endless repetition? Whatever the reason, it's clear these were not purely holy spaces. Human thoughts leaked in desire, curiosity, and mischief creeping along the edges of illuminated scripture, like ivy on stone. You find another volume of herbal text. On page 72, nestled between drawings of mandrake and wormwood, there's an odd sketch, a woman mounting a man, captioned with Latin that loosely translates to, "Against the sin of morning weakness." You snort softly. Not quite what you expected from a monastery shelf, but the real secrets lie in confession. You slip past the scriptorium into a corridor lined with small doors, confessional booths. You pause beside one. Inside, a monk listens, patiently. Outside, a young man waits, pacing. Finally, the curtain shifts. The monk steps out. His face is composed, but his eyes flick toward the boy in a way that lingers. Just a second too long. Medieval monastic life was not always as chaste as the rule books claimed. Benedictine, Cistercian, Cluniacal, these orders wrote strict rules about abstinence, about purging lust, about the dangers of self-pollution. Yes, they meant exactly what you think. And yet, Documents survive. Letters between monks expressing longing. Trial records of monks caught in compromising situations. Even PayPal reprimands, scolding entire abbeys for inappropriate fraternal affection. You duck into a cloister garden. Quiet now, moonlight on stone. And there, beneath a bench, you find a small folded parchment. A love poem, simple, sincere, addressed not to my lady, but to Brother Matthew. It's unsigned, but the ink is still sharp, recently written. Another quirky detail. In some regions, monasteries were infamous for producing not just saints but erotica. You pass a pile of discarded manuscripts and spot one copied in the neat hand of a very bored monk. It's a translation of Ovid's Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love. Explicit, clever, and technically banned. And yet, here it is, complete, annotated. Some monks rationalized it. To better understand sin, we must study it, one wrote. Others just enjoyed the writing. One scribe, you learn, became obsessed with the story of a woman who disguised herself as a monk, for decades only discovered after death. His margins are filled with curious questions. Could such a body be hidden? Did others know and keep silent? You realize, suddenly, that gender and sexuality were not simple categories. Even then, they were being tested, explored, sometimes secretly lived. You return to the refectory, where dinner is being served in silence. Pottage, bread, ale. A young novice spills his cup. The older monk beside him mutters, "You're too clumsy for God's work." But then his hand reaches out, not to help, but to rest briefly intimately on the boy's back. You pretend not to notice. It's uncomfortable, but it's real. And while many monks surely lived quietly, faithfully, others bent the rules, twisted them, or broke them completely. You visit a nearby nunnery, too, expecting serenity, chastity. You find a love letter written in fine, female script, addressed to Brother Lucien, sealed with wax, slipped between hymnals. In the garden, two nuns whisper beneath their veils. One laughs too loudly. The other glances toward the convent wall. There's an old tale told here of a nun who bore a child and claimed it was by the Holy Spirit. A scandal, but no one could agree who the father was. The church buried the story, but the villagers still tell it, under breath, around hearths. You pass a stained glass window depicting Saint Agatha, but look closer beneath her robes. Barely visible is a tiny rebellious image, a bird pecking at a fruit. The fruit is suggestively shaped. You shake your head, even in stained glass. Apparently, yes. There's a strange comfort in all this. Not in the misbehavior itself, but in the humanity. The reminder that even those sworn to silence and celibacy wrestled with the same hungers, the same loneliness, the same occasional slip into desire. You exit the monastery just before dawn. The chanting starts again. Low, gentle, sincere. You stand in the frosty grass and think of all the contradictions inside those stone walls. The prayers, the pleasures, the failures, the forgiveness. Because in the end, holiness isn't always clean, and sin isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just a drawing in the margin, a glance across a pew, a poem folded beneath a bench. You breathe in the cold morning air, and let it go. You open an iron door, and step into a reliquary room dim smoky, saturated with the smell of incense and time. Walls glint with gold, ruby, and bone. Here, in this silent chamber, lie the fragments of saint skulls encased in crystal. Fingers wrapped in velvet, even a full spine resting on crushed velvet, like a sleeping serpent. At first it feels sacred, solemn, a place of faith. But stay a little longer, and the mood changes. You approach one ornate box. The label claims it holds the milk of the Virgin Mary. You raise a skeptical eyebrow. The liquid is cloudy, viscous, sealed in an ancient vial. Historians still debate how seriously such relics were taken. Some say they were symbols, not literal objects. Others argue that entire towns fought wars over these proofs of proximity to God. But not all relics inspired reverence. Some, believe it or not, were used for deeply unholy purposes. You wandered deeper into the chamber, past gilded chalices and bones of questionable origin. Behind a side curtain, tucked discreetly on a shelf, is something strange. A phallic-shaped stone relic, worn smooth by centuries of touch. The monk nearby says it's the fertility stone of Saint Ethelreda. You ask if it's a joke. He doesn't laugh. Because here's the truth. For many desperate couples, holy relics weren't just for prayer. They were instruments of hope, of intervention, of intimacy. You hear stories of women straddling stone effigies of saints in hopes of becoming pregnant, of men rubbing relics against their loins to cure impotence, of entire pilgrimages devoted to boosting bedroom success. You think it sounds ridiculous until you realize what people were facing. No real medicine, no IVF, no knowledge of hormones or anatomy, just faith and fear. A particularly strange account from 14th century France describes a church where women crawled under the altaris, physically beneath it while moaning prayers for fertility. The priest would swing the incense overhead and chant blessings, eyes carefully averted, or not. You sit on a bench beside a reliquary shaped like a heart. Inside it, supposedly, are the ashes of a martyred virgin who vowed never to touch man or beast. But the inscription is blurred, the story unclear. Some believe she died in childbirth. Others say she died of starvation after refusing a suitor. Either way, she's become a patron saint for those tempted in the night. You begin to suspect that even sainthood has a shadow. You exit into a private chapel and see a statue of Saint Agnes, patron of virgins. She's young, beautiful, surrounded by lambs, but at her feet is an object that doesn't quite belong, a pair of manacles, rusted and worn. You ask a passing priest what they're for. He answers softly, they were hers, to protect her purity. You don't ask what that means, but you can guess. Some saints, it turns out, were revered because they suffered sexually, beheaded for refusing marriage, thrown into brothels and emerging untouched. Stories soaked in violence turned into symbols of holiness, and while men had their miracles healing the sick, walking on water, female saints often had their virginity. That was the miracle. You remember something else? Relics were sometimes eaten. Yes, consumed. You turn to an old pilgrim's diary, stored under glass. One passage stands out. A traveler describes being given St. Margaret's blessed dust to sprinkle into wine and drink on his wedding night. He believed it would fortify the manly urge. You laugh and then immediately regret it, because, well, it probably tasted like limestone and mildew. Still, you can't deny the power of belief. One particularly bizarre fringe ritual was practiced in parts of rural Germany. Couples struggling to conceive would sneak into a chapel at night, place a relic between their naked bodies, and recite psalms while doing exactly what you think they were doing. It wasn't approved, of course, but it happened. Enough times that bishops started locking reliquary doors, and even then, people found a way in. You lean closer to one reliquary and spot fingerprints in the dust. Fresh, maybe not hours old, but recent enough. A quiet reminder that despite all the silence and reverence, people still come here with very human needs. You pass by another display, a toe bone set in silver. No name, just labeled unknown martyr. But beside it, a folded scrap of parchment. A prayer from someone named Alfreda, asking for release from temptation. You wonder what she meant, and whether it worked. The truth is, these objects weren't just about worship. They were about control. Whoever held the relics held the people's attention, their fears, their desires. Churches built entire economies around them, charging pilgrims to touch, to see, to feel, and in some cases, to hope that touching something sacred might fix what was broken in their beds. Another odd tidbit, Relic theft was a real thing. Holy heists, if you will. One monk confessed in 1287 to stealing a saint's rib and hiding it in his robes. Why? To bless his cousin's upcoming wedding. He claimed the bone helped her conceive twins. The abbey was less amused. You stare now at the final relic in the room. A wooden carving of the Christ child, worn smooth on the cheeks and, oddly, the thighs. Locals once believed that holding it between one's legs during labor ensured a safe birth. The practice was banned, then quietly re-allowed, then banned again. You're beginning to see a pattern, because sacred doesn't mean untouchable, not here. And purity doesn't mean absence of longing. In fact, it seems the holiest spaces were often where the strangest mixing occurred: desire and devotion, shame and sacredness, the body and the bone. You step out of the reliquary room into the cool night air, eyes blinking at the sudden clarity. You walk a few steps and stop beside a small stone fountain, said to be blessed by a saint who watched over newlyweds. You sit, dip your fingers in, and feel the chill run up your arm. The water tastes like metal, like time, like secrets. And just for a moment, you understand why people believed it could do the impossible. You step into the warm hush of a small country church just as the bells finish their soft clanging. The pews creak beneath the weight of gossip and guilt. Behind the altar, a wooden confessional box sits like a waiting mouth, quiet, carved, and full of secrets. You move closer, not for prayer, just curiosity. That's enough in this place. You slip inside the booth. It's cramped, smelling of old varnish and breath. Through the narrow screen, you see nothing, just darkness. You imagine the whispers that have passed through here, the confessions, the sins. But here's the twist. Sometimes, it wasn't just the parishioners confessing their temptations. Sometimes, it was the priests causing them. You overhear a conversation outside, a nervous woman asking the curate if he'll be gentle this time. Her voice trembles. His doesn't. You freeze. Something about it feels wrong. Not pastoral, not safe. Because for all the church's authority over sexual behavior, the ones hearing the sins weren't always free from them. Historians still argue how widespread this abuse of power really was. The church certainly tried to regulate it. Canon law forbade priests from soliciting sex during confession as early as the 11th century. But the enforcement, uneven, local, sometimes non-existent, especially in remote villages where the priest was not just a spiritual leader, but the only literate man around. A figure of fear, admiration, and dangerous opportunity. You emerge from the booth and follow the curate at a distance. He enters, a side room where 2 candles flicker. A woman enters behind him, her shawl drawn tight. The door closes. You don't hear what happens, but the silence is telling. You leave quietly, and outside, you meet another woman, older, face lined, eyes steady. She sells holy cards and ribbons. You know what they call that box, don't you? She asks, nodding toward the confessional. You shake your head. The devil's whisper hole. It's not just a joke. In parts of medieval Italy and France, records survive of priests seducing or coercing parishioners during confession, sometimes with promises of forgiveness, sometimes with threats of damnation. A few even claim that intimacy with a priest was holier than with a husband, that it cleansed the soul. You blink. A bishop's letter from the 13th century scolds his clergy for replacing penance with pleasure. In one case, a priest in Toulouse told women that sins of the flesh could only be removed through sacred union, which conveniently required nudity and privacy. His trial notes survive. His punishment does not. You duck into a nearby sacristy. A dusty ledger sits on the desk. Lists of names. Scenes confessed. But some entries are odd-marked, not with Latin, but symbols. You trace one. A feather. Another. A pair. Coded language. Shameful shorthand. Or simply a way to hide what couldn't be written aloud. You flip to the back page. One scrawl stands out. She wept afterward. I did not. You close the book. Not all confessions were stolen moments. Some were genuine cries for help. And yet, the imbalance was always there. The confessor held the power. He decided the penance, the forgiveness, the soul's worth. And some twisted that authority into something else entirely. One quirky record from 14th century. Poland details a trial in which a priest required women to bring small tokens, lace ribbons, scented oils before hearing their confessions. When questioned, he claimed these were symbolic offerings. The court didn't buy it. He was exiled. Quietly. No jail. Just moved to another parish. Sound familiar? And then there's the case of confession marriages. You pass a pair of pilgrims kneeling before a cross, whispering to one another. You listen carefully. They're speaking of a girl in their village who was seduced by a priest during Lent. When her belly began to swell, he performed a secret marriage ceremony in the chapel. Said it made everything clean. Her baby was stillborn. He vanished before Epiphany. You want to believe that's rare. But stories like hers surface across Europe, part myth, part reality, always edged with sorrow. You wander now to a small chapel, known for its confessional healing. Inside, a fresco depicts a woman kneeling in a booth, hands lifted, light pouring down. But in the shadows, a second figure, a man, not Jesus, touching her hair. You squint. It's subtle, maybe unintentional, or maybe a silent warning painted by someone who'd seen too much. Still, not all these interactions were predatory. You pass a monk in quiet conversation with a man on the church steps. They're laughing softly. The monk touches his shoulder, not suggestively, but kindly. You sense warmth. You remember that. Not every priest failed his vows. Some lived them beautifully. Some listened with care. Some helped, but the boundary between confession and connection was always thin. In one account, a priest fell in love with a woman whose sins he'd heard for years. When she died suddenly in childbirth, he carved a secret message into the pew she always sat in. My heart heard yours before God did. It's still there, in a small chapel outside Milan. You add it to your list of places to see someday, and maybe that's the strangest thing of all. Confession was meant to purify, but sometimes it exposed the messiest parts of the soul, not just for the confessing, but for the one listening. Desire, loneliness, power, forgiveness, they all swirl together behind that screen. Now, as you leave the church and step into the moonlight, you imagine your own breath fogging up the wood of the confessional. What would you say? What secrets would you whisper, knowing someone on the other side holds the keys to absolution? And would you trust them? Tonight, it doesn't matter. The booth is empty. The candles burned low. And the only thing you confess now is that you're tired and ready to sleep. You're walking along a cobbled path, away from the churches. Now, past the market square, where pigs scream and gossip flows louder than wine. There's music ahead, flutes, fiddles, the rhythmic clack of wooden heels on stone. And there, in the clearing just beyond the village walls, is a sight so wildly out of place, you stop short. A maypole, tall, wrapped in ribbons, surrounded by dancers spinning in loose circles. Women with their hair unbraided, men stripped to their tunics. A circle of laughter, flushed cheeks, and well-heaving chests. You've wandered into a fertility rite. No, not a ritual in the sacrificial sense. Just something earthy. A springtime tradition meant to honor nature, love, lust, and the sticky, sensual business of being alive. You step closer. This isn't the stiff pageantry of court life, or the shadowed shame of confession. This is raw, joyful, celebratory, a different kind of sacred, and it was common. In many regions of medieval Europe, seasonal festivals like Beltane or May Day became outlets for sanctioned mischief, times when rules bent, modesty slipped, and desire danced freely. You see a girl leaping over a small bonfire, skirts flying. Her friends shriek with laughter. Nearby, a couple disappears into the woods. You glance away, half embarrassed, half envious. It's almost romantic, but don't let the flower crowns fool you. There's something calculated here. These rituals, while lively, weren't just about celebration, they were strategic. Communities depended on birth, on fertility. A bad harvest, a barren year, too few births. That meant starvation, death, collapse. So anything that encouraged successful mating, if it looked like debauchery, had a purpose. A mainstream fact. In parts of Germany and France, entire villages held mock weddings during these festivals. Couples would pair off, share a bed, and see if pregnancy resulted. If it did, they were married the next year. If not, no harm done, at least officially. You imagine how awkward the next morning must have been. And there's a fringe detail that makes your jaw tighten. Some local customs allowed night visitors. During these festivals, a man could enter a woman's home uninvited, lie beside her, and if she didn't protest, it was considered consent. If she did, the village elders might still side with him, especially if he was a good match or her family stood to gain. Historians still argue whether these were acts of freedom or control. Were women empowered by the chance to choose a lover outside arranged marriages, or trapped by customs that let others define their silence? You move past the dancers toward a circle of older women, seated in the grass, humming. One of them has herbs braided into her hair, sage mugwort, rosemary. She watches you with knowing eyes. Looking for love, are you? She says. You start to deny it, but she laughs. Too late. You've stepped into the Beltane ring now. Your heart's already opened. You chuckle, but you're unsettled, because this celebration isn't tame, it's wild. And that wildness, while liberating, could also turn dark. In parts of Britain, you hear, festivals like these were seen as breeding grounds for sinso, much so that the church tried to ban them repeatedly. Priests warned of dancing devils, of moonlit sin, but the people kept dancing, kept slipping into the woods, kept whispering their prayers to fertility gods older than Christ. Some scholars believe this is where the legends of witches and sabbats took root, not from actual sorcery, but from memories of these sensual, nature-based rites. What better way to suppress sexuality than to demonize the women who embodied it? You sit on a log beside a man carving runes into bark. This one's for strength, he says, tracing a jagged line. This one's for seed. He winks. You laugh awkwardly, not sure where to look. Another woman approaches with a wreath of thistle and ivy. For stamina, she says, plopping it on your head. Thanks. And then she leans close, voice low. Careful who you dance with tonight. Some blessings don't leave in the morning. You wonder what she means, but before you can ask, the drums begin again. The sun dips low now, and torches are lit. The dancing grows slower, closer. Bodies press together, hands linger. Somewhere, someone starts singing a ballad about the green man and the flame lady. You don't understand all the words, but you know what they mean. You wander again, deeper into the edge of the forest. Behind a tree, you spot another couple, her back arched, his hand pressed to her mouth to keep her giggles quiet. It's not obscene, it's intimate, and somehow ancient. Like a ritual older than language. This kind of freedom, you realize, existed alongside repression. In the same world, the same calendar, Lent, then Beltane, chastity, then carnality. It wasn't contradiction, it was balance. Permission to want if only for one night. You sit under a willow and watch the shadows move. You think about how joy and survival intertwined, how sex wasn't always about romance, or even pleasure. Sometimes, it was necessity, hope, insurance for next year's harvest. A strange practice once existed in Slavic regions after a poor crop. Villagers would anoint the fields with bodily fluids, believing it might restore fertility to the earth. You hope they meant sweat. You're not sure. And yet, in these moments, medieval Europe doesn't feel so dark or prudish. It feels human, messy, hungry for touch and laughter and the reassurance of life continuing. You lie back on the grass, wreaths still crooked on your head. Above you, stars blink between tree branches. Music swells again, and you hear someone shout your name. Or maybe it just sounds like your name. You close your eyes, let the rhythm pull you, and for once, let the story slip into something softer. You wake to the smell of warm ale and firewood. Your head still echoes with drum beats, though the maypole and its dancers have vanished behind the trees. The grass is damp. The world is quiet again, but not for long. A new sound draws you toward a cluster of buildings at the edge of a walled town. Shouting, cheers, laughter, a few muffled groans, and then a sudden, unmistakable snap like wood breaking under pressure. You're at the public square, and today, there's a punishment on display. Two figures are tied back to a tall wooden flushed, humiliated, their names scrawled in charcoal on a hanging board. One is a baker's apprentice, the other, a married woman from the butcher's family. You don't need to ask what they've done. The town crier already yelled it 3 times, caught in lust, punished for scandal, flogged for fornication. You wince as the whip cracks again, not just for the pain, for the spectacle, because in medieval Europe, punishment was performance. You find a spot on the edge of the crowd. Everyone's watching, children with bread in their hands, grandmothers, whispering behind scarves, and even a friar, half hidden beneath his hood. One man cheers a little too enthusiastically, another spits near the woman's feet. This isn't justice, it's theater and sex crimes. They sold tickets. Historically, public punishments for adultery, fornication, or bawdry were disturbingly common and often gendered. A woman might be shaved bald, her clothes ripped, paraded on a donkey. A man might be whipped or locked in a cucking stool, dunked repeatedly into a river until teeth chattered and shame drowned pride. But what counted as a crime was slippery. Married women caught with lovers, punished. Unmarried girls who got pregnant, punished. Men caught with other men, often executed, yet rich nobles, frequently excused. You watch now as a scribe records the flogging in the town book but doesn't list the names of the spectators. You wander away, stomach uneasy, until you find the pillory, a crude wooden stalk still damp with last night's rain. There's a damp rag nearby, a few pieces of half-rotten fruit underfoot, and a broken sign that reads, "For indecent speech." You raise a brow. In some towns, gossiping women could be charged with scandalum, magnatum great scandal, not because of the words themselves, but because loose lips might spread tales of other loose behavior. You spot an old mural on a nearby wall, depicting 2 women chained by their tongues to a church pillar, likely metaphorical, hopefully. Still, tongue clamps were real. One fringe artifact from medieval Wales, now lost, but once described in detail, was a scold's bridle, a metal cage for the head, with a spike to hold the tongue down, supposedly used on women too free with their words. Some reports claim they were used on women accused of propositioning men or simply speaking about their desires too openly. Historians still debate how often they were actually used, but whether tool or threat, the message was clear. Don't talk, don't want, don't step out of line. But if you had to be punished for a sexual transgression, better to be rich. A nobleman caught with his chambermaid might pay a fine. A bishop caught with a novice, transferred. A merchant's daughter, quietly married off. The unevenness glares like torchlight now, as you watch a teenage boy being marched out with Letcher written on a slate around his neck. He's barely more than a child. You follow the crowd toward the edge of town, where another correction is about to begin. This one involves a couple found rutting in a barn. During Lent, The priest was especially upset about the timing. Meat was forbidden, so, apparently, was flesh. The sentence? Naked parade. Not entirely naked shirts, loosely tied, pants gone, hands bound behind their backs. They're forced to walk in silence, while townsfolk jeer, some throwing handfuls of damp hay. You hear a woman yell, "God sees everything." Another laughs, but not when it's dark. You wonder how many of these people would do the same thing, given the chance. And then there's the worst kind of punishment, the permanent one. In a side alley, carved into the stone wall of a tavern, you find the faded outline of a branda symbol once seared onto the skin of repeat offenders. Sometimes a letter A, sometimes a mark shaped like a stake or fork. It burned, it bled, and it stayed. A scar of shame that never faded. But branding wasn't just physical. You hear a mother whispering to her child, pointing at a girl across the square. "That one's a whore," she says. The girl is maybe 17, her dress too tight, her eyes too tired. She turns and stares straight at you. Not afraid, not broken, just used to it. You want to ask her something, anything, but she walks away before you can. And you're left there, under the sky thick with smoke and judgment, wondering how much of this was ever about morality, and how much was about control, about fear, about reminding people, especially women, that the cost of desire was high, public, humiliating, but not always. You pass a note scribbled on a back wall, under a window ledge where lovers meet after dark. It reads, "They shamed us by day, but at night, we burn brighter." A whisper of resistance, of secret pride, and you remember. Even in this world of punishments and piety, sex didn't go away. It went underground, into woods, back rooms, barn lofts, candlelit attics. It wasn't erased, just hidden, repackaged, or flaunted at the edges of power. Because humans don't stop wanting just because someone's watching. You leave the square, footsteps quickening, as the crowd roars again. Behind you, the lashes keep falling, the boards creak, the voices cheer. But ahead, there's silence. And somewhere in that silence, someone is touching someone else, not out of sin or shame, but because the night is soft, and the fire is warm, and being human is heavier than any punishment ever carved in wood. You wander farther from the square until the stones turn to dust, the path narrows, and the houses begin to lean inward, like gossiping old women. Here, you've entered a part of town whispered about, not mapped. A place where curtains stay drawn, doors open only part way, and laughter sounds different, slower, deeper, like a purr laced with coin. You're in the red light quarter, except of course, there are no actual red lights. Just oil lamps and flickering torches outside homes that don't advertise, but don't exactly hide either. A ribbon tied to a window, a symbol etched in chalk, the subtle tilt of a shutter. You follow the signs, and there she is. A woman leaning in a doorway, her bodice low, her expression unreadable. She doesn't call out, doesn't beckon, just watches you pass by, respectful, curious. Behind her, you glimpse soft fabrics, flickering candles, a bowl of rose petals soaking in wine. Not squalor, not shame, a bordello, and, surprisingly, a regulated one. Because in many medieval cities, sex work wasn't hidden, it was managed, licensed, taxed. The town knew who the public women were, and while they carried stigma, they also carried protection, of a sort, in places like Toulouse, Avignon, London, and Venice. Official brothels were operated under civic oversight, with rules for hygiene, dress, and even behavior. Mainstream fact: some cities had designated clothing for sex workers: yellow hoods, striped cloaks, or bells at the hem, supposedly to warn others. But it also meant they couldn't be mistaken for respectable women, even when they walked with more dignity than half the wives at market. You step inside the house, not out of need, just to look. The room smells of lavender and wood smoke. A woman is braiding another's hair. A third sings softly while arranging ribbons. It's quieter than you expected. No moaning, no wild debauchery, just life. There's even a rules board. No fighting, no underage clients, no drunkenness, no priests. You raise an eyebrow at that last one. The woman beside you laughs. They come anyway, she says, just without the color. Some brothels were owned by women, passed down through generations, like bakeries or inns. Others were run by men less kindly, more cruelly. Still others operated under church oversight. Yes, you heard that right. In some cases, brothels paid rent to religious institutions. One bishop in Vienna collected regular income from the city's largest house of pleasure. Historians still argue whether this was pragmatic tolerance or moral hypocrisy. You speak with a girl named Isabella. She's maybe 19, clever-eyed, and surprisingly blunt. They call us sinners, she says, but we know more about mercy than any priest. She points to a drawer. Inside, clean linens, herbal wash, soft cloths, dried rose hips. It's not all filth, she adds. We keep each other healthy, safer than a village marriage. Sometimes, she's not wrong. In some places, brothels were the only places offering basic protection, regular baths, contraceptive herbs, knowledge passed from older women to younger ones. The church condemned it, of course, but rarely shut it down, because even moral panic has its limits, and lust pays well. A fringe practice once popular in certain Italian cities, penitent brothels, places where sex workers could earn indulgences by confessing regularly, donating part of their earnings, or, bizarrely, letting certain clerics supervise their work under the guise of saving their souls. One scribe from the 15th century recounts a nun-turned madam who was beloved by her neighborhood for keeping the girls clean, safe, and literate. The bishop called her a devil. The townspeople called her Mother Benedetta. She was buried, in secret, her grave marked only by a small engraved heart. You walk upstairs, where soft laughter echoes down the corridor. A door is open. Inside, a man lies naked on a feather-stuffed mattress, his feet being massaged by a woman humming a lullaby. Nothing lewd, just a moment of warmth in a cold world. You exit quietly. But brothels weren't the only stage for sex work. You pass a bathhouse next to public one, where men and women once bathed, side by side. Naked but not necessarily erotic, or rather, not only erotic. Bathhouses were social spaces, meeting places, and, yes, sometimes pickup spots. In some towns, they were even staffed with attendants, known to offer comfort, for a little extra. Eventually, that's what caused the bathhouse's decline. Too tempting. Too many sins of the steam, as one bishop called them. But you can still imagine it: the warm water, the scent of bay leaves and lye, the flicker of candlelight, the brush of skin, temptation in every ripple. You hear a commotion now, shouting at the end of the street. A girl is being dragged by her hair, accused of soliciting a friar. The irony is thick. You move toward the crowd, but before you get close, an older woman steps in. A brothel madam, judging by her bearing. She throws a handful of coins to the guard. "Let her go," she snaps. And he does. Power, it seems, comes in many forms. Not every sex worker lived with such protection, of course. Many were alone, desperate, trapped in cycles of debt and disease. Some cities enforced regular health checks, often invasive, humiliating. Others simply let the women die, then blamed them for the deaths. You find a quiet corner and light a small candle. Someone has etched a poem into the stone. Greater than she gave him all, greater than, and still he left. A saint in silk, greater than with sinner's breath. It stays with you, because sex work in medieval Europe wasn't just about sin or service. It was about survival, agency, exploitation, community, all knotted together in candlelight and coin. You walk away slowly, past women leaning in doorways, men adjusting their collars, lanterns flickering like stars on earth. And as you go, you think of Isabetta, of Mother Benedetta, of the girls braiding hair and sharing herbs. And you realize, not all who were bought were broken. Some held power in their own quiet way. You leave the brothel quarter behind and follow the road out of town, through a gate where the stone gives way to dirt, where the air feels cleaner but somehow colder. You've spent the night among walls and whispers. Now you step into something older, stranger, woven into the bones of the earth itself. A circle of stones stands ahead, half buried in grass and shadow. Not grand like Stonehenge's smaller, rougher, but still sacred. At least, to someone. You approach slowly, your boots crunching dried leaves. A man kneels near one of the stones, hands pressed flat against it. He's humming. Not a hymn, something else. He doesn't look up when you pass, because you've crossed into the world of folk magic. Before the church tightened its grip, for every healer was called a witch. And every ritual, a sin. There were other ways of knowing, other forms of belief, especially when it came to love, sex, and the unruly power of the body. You sit near the edge of the circle. You listen? A girl nearby unpacks a bundle wrapped in linen. Inside, dried herbs, a lock of hair, a carved wooden figure, and a small flask of what might be honey or blood. She arranges everything carefully on the stone and begins to chant. You don't understand the words, but the intention, that's clear. She wants someone, not to hurt, not to bind, just to be seen, held, desired. And this ritual is older than commandments. You'll learn that in villages across Europe, love magic was part of life. Mainstream fact. It was especially common among women. Recipes passed from grandmother to granddaughter. A pinch of rue, a drop of sweat, a ribbon tied to a lover's bedpost. It wasn't considered wicked until it worked a little too well. The church condemned it, of course, said it came from demons. But the people kept doing it, because prayer didn't always bring you the one you wanted. Sometimes, you needed a charm. You approach a mossy stone and find something tucked into a crack, a scrap of parchment, barely legible. Greater than let his eyes seek only me. Let her womb carry my name. Let no rival flourish. You shiver, not out of fear, out of recognition. There's power here, desire, yes, but more than that, agency. In a world where marriages were arranged, where women were traded like property, where love was rarely a choice, folk magic was resistance, rebellion, a whispered no to a world that rarely asked permission. You meet an old woman crouched beside a hawthorn bush. She grins a gap-toothed smile and offers you a bundle of rosemary. For clarity, she says, then tucks a clove of garlic into your hand. For passion, you thank her. She pats your cheek. Don't waste it. She shows you her tools. Bones, wax, a candle shaped like a man, with pins in its chest, not to harm, she insists, but to focus the energy. I don't hex, she says. I redirect. You believe her. But not all love magic was gentle. A fringe practice you overhear in certain parts of the Balkans. Women would mix menstrual blood into a lover's drink to bind his heart. Scholars still debate whether this was common or exaggerated by scandalized clerics. Either way, it lingered in the cultural imagination as the ultimate act of enchantment and violation. You walk on, past a stream where a girl is tossing flower petals into the water while reciting names. If it floats, he loves me. If it sinks, he's false. You watch a daisy spiral downriver, petals clinging to its edges like whispered hopes. Further on, you see a figure hunched over a doll. Not a toy, a puppet, fashioned from scraps of cloth and wool, tied with red string, a charm to call someone's loins. The woman tells you, her eyes twinkle. It's for my husband. He's gotten lazy. You laugh, despite yourself. But you realize something else. Men used these charms too. Love filters, mixtures of herbs and animal parts were sold at fairs. One recipe you over here includes honey, crushed antlers, and a piece of the intended lover's hair. Drink it under the moon, the seller whispers, and she never stray. You wonder how many young hearts clung to that promise, even as the herbs turned bitter. Another tale. In northern Scotland, fishermen carved runes into their oars, believing it would make women pine for them while they were at sea. Some added a sprig of heather beneath their belts for fertile winds. The line between superstition and survival, thin, blurred, and always intimate. You arrive now at a clearing where couples used to meet in secret. It's said that on Midsummer's Night, any kiss given here binds to souls for a year. A young couple walks past you, hands intertwined. They don't look at you, but the boy presses something into the girl's palm. Perhaps a charm, perhaps just a pebble. Still, you feel the magic hum in the air. The church tried to crush this world, declared it dangerous, but it never really died. It went underground, into kitchens, into cradles, into the quiet moments where someone whispered a name and hoped the wind would carry it to the right ears. You think of the girl with the wooden figure, the old woman with garlic and laughter, the lovers by the stream, the carved runes, the daisy that floated. This too was part of medieval sexuality, not the grotesque, not the punished, but the mystical, the intimate, the irrational hope that wanting something deeply enough could make it real. And maybe, sometimes, it did. You leave a ribbon on a branch as you pass, just in case. Not for love. Not yet, just for tenderness. You wake to the sound of bells, not church bells this time, but smaller ones, delicate and constant. They jingle with each step as a cart rattles past you, drawn by a donkey wearing a faded velvet harness. The driver is dressed in orange silk, face painted white, lips stained berry red. You blink. He bows. "Welcome to the pageant," he says, voice like a laugh wrapped in perfume. You've wandered into the domain of performers, traveling actors, jesters, minstrels, people who move between towns like whispers, carrying stories and songs and, often, scandal. Because behind the masks and melodies, there's something looser, a different moral code, or maybe just no code at all. You follow the cart to a makeshift stage where a crowd gathers. Children sit cross-legged in front, adults stand in the back. A puppet show begins, crude, bawdy, full of exaggerated gestures. The husband puppet is tiny, squeaky. The wife puppet is larger, louder, armed with a rolling pin. The joke, as usual, is on him. The crowd howls with laughter, because medieval sexual humor wasn't shy. It was direct, physical, joyfully vulgar, a mainstream fact. Morality plays were meant to teach virtue, but many included Bodhi, characters lustful friars, oversexed widows, cheating lovers used as comic relief. People loved them. They didn't see contradiction, they saw reflection. You glance around. No one's shocked. They've seen worse, heard worse, lived it. One jester takes the stage, now dressed in bells and patchwork, balancing on a barrel. He performs a song of seduction in falsetto, mimicking a noblewoman, luring a peasant into her bed. His hips wiggle. The crowd shrieks. Then he switches voices. Now the peasant brags about the conquest to his sheep. Yes, sheep. You smirk, and then wonder how much of this is comedy, how much commentary. Because in these traveling acts, nothing was off limits. Sex, class, religion, power, everything could be mocked, especially in the language of double meanings. Innuendo. You overhear a popular joke. Greater than why did the nun refuse the monk's advances? Because she was already married to wine and whispers. Risque, certainly, but surprisingly tolerated. In fact, some medieval courts employed jesters, not just for laughs but to say things no one else dared. A jester might crack a joke about a nobleman's affairs and, in doing so, shame him more effectively than any sermon. You pass a troupe of actors rehearsing a play called The Miller's Wife. The script involves mistaken identity, secret doorways, and lots of hiding under beds. At least 3 people lose their clothes. At one point, a character seduces his own aunt by accident. You raise your eyebrows, but they shrugged. It's tradition, one of them says, adjusting her wooden breastplate. Everyone loves a little incest on feast day. Dark humor, but not uncommon. There's a fringe fact you can't unknow. In some village festivals, local traditions included comedic fake weddings, where roles were reversed. Women played men, servants played lords, priests married donkeys. And yes, sometimes these mock weddings ended in mock consummations. Simulated, of course. Mostly, historians still argue whether this was harmless fun or dangerous blasphemy. You wander past the stage and into the actors' camp. Tents flap in the breeze, revealing colorful costumes, pots of grease paint, jugs of sour wine. A young man practices flipping a dagger. A woman in a sheer tunic lies on a fur rug, reading aloud from a play that sounds suspiciously like erotica. You approach a wooden cart labeled Loot Lessons and Love Advice. A man with a painted mustache beckons you inside. Want to know if she's thinking of you? He asks. You hesitate. He smirks. Then maybe you'd like to know how to make her think of you. He offers a crude pamphlet. Asterisk, 20 phrases that work every time. Asterisk, you flip through it. There, vivid, anatomically improbable, but undeniably creative. You ask where he learned this stuff. He grins. The streets, the sheets, the stage. Because performers weren't just entertainers. They were observers, mimics, mirrors. They saw what people really wanted, dunder, the lace, beneath the sermons and gave it back to them with laughter and rhythm. One performance you hear involved a puppet called Brother Beggar who seduced every woman in the village using only one word, forgive. The joke wasn't about lust, it was about power, about how forgiveness was currency, how men used piety as foreplay. The people got it. You sit with a group of jugglers drinking beer and exchanging stories. One tells of a noble woman who paid to have her husband's affairs reenacted by actors just so she could laugh at them. Another claims he once performed in a brothel for an audience of 3, a merchant, his wife, and her lover. None of them knew who invited the show. You hear about a group of women in Prague who put on erotic mysteries behind closed doors, their audience. Mostly other women. Was it theater, or a ritual, or just freedom? No one knows, but everyone wants to go. You lie back now, on a patch of grass beside the camp. The moon rises. The bells jingle again. Someone plays a lute, soft clumsy chords. Someone else is humming. A few tents are moving rhythmically. You don't stare. You just listen. Because this world, chaotic and colorful, holds a different truth. It says, desire doesn't have to be punished. It can be played with, mocked, sung, shared, and maybe laughter is the safest way to speak the unspeakable. One last scene plays out before your eyes, a firelit stage. 2 actors kissing passionately, then pulling back to slap each other dramatically. The audience roars. A 3rd actor leaps between them, yells, and that's how babies are made. Everyone collapses. You laugh too, and you think, for all its crudeness, its spectacle, its absurdity, this was a world where people found release thought, not just in the act, but in the telling, in saying what couldn't be said, wrapped in jest and rhyme. You close your eyes. The bells fade. The jester bows. The play goes on. It's nearly dawn now, and the world feels hushed in that strange in-between, too late for last night, too early for this morning. You walk toward a rising line of hills, fields stretching outward in fog-draped layers. A distant rooster crows. Somewhere behind you, a dog barks and then falls silent. Ahead, a cottage. Modest, tidy. The shutters are open. Smoke curls from the chimney. You hear the creak of a wooden cradle inside, and a woman's voice singing a lullaby. You pause at the gate, not to intrude, just to listen, because this, too, is part of the story, not the brothels, not the whips, but the quiet, daily choices of women who lived beneath the weight of sex, love, and survival. The married ones, the widowed ones, the ones who gave birth alone. She sees you. She smiles, gestures for you to come in. Inside, the room is warm. The baby sleeps. A pot boils gently over the fire. It sent a mix of barley, milk, and herbs you can't name. She hands you a cup of water and sits down across from you, her hands calloused, eyes steady. You're curious, she says. Everyone is. But they never ask the right questions. You don't ask. You just wait. She tells you what it means to be a woman here. In this time, in this skin. To be taught that your worth lies in your womb. That your duty is to be modest, obedient, available but also fertile, passionate, even seductive. Once the church doors close, she chuckles dryly. There's no guidebook, you know, just rules and punishment and whispers, a mainstream fact. In medieval Europe, married women were legally and religiously obligated to provide sex to their husbands. It was known as the marital debt. If she refused, he could take her to court, and he often did. But no one called it rape, because marriage made everything permissible, even silence. You glance at the cradle. The baby stirs, sighs. She tells you about the midwives, about childbirth and flickering candlelight, with neighbors singing softly outside the door to keep the mother from crossing into death. About how some women tied relics to their thighs or whispered prayers to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of pregnant women. You bleed, she says. You tear, you scream. And if the baby lives, you pray the next one doesn't come too soon, or too late, or at all. Because children were both blessing and burden, and sometimes danger. You learn of churching, a ritual that welcomed new mothers back into the community after childbirth, once they were deemed clean again. Until then, they were seen as ritually impure, even cursed. Couldn't enter church, couldn't touch holy objects, couldn't be touched unless, of course, by a husband who didn't care about rituals. She laughs at that. The line between penance and play, paper thin. Historians still argue whether such practices were genuine spiritual exercises or repressed sensuality masquerading as ritual. You walk behind the building now, into a courtyard littered with worn wooden benches and old stained glass shards. A nun is washing cloths in a basin. She nods as you approach. Don't worry, she says. It's not always about punishment. She pulls out a small book from beneath her habit, opens it. Inside are sketches, anatomical drawings, charts of the moon, poems. One reads, greater than to touch without touching, greater than to hunger without shame, greater than is this not devotion? She smiles. There were mystics, she says softly. Men and women who believed that love of God could be physical, that the body wasn't the enemy, that ecstasy could be holy. You've heard of them, like Mechthild of Magdeburg, who described divine union as a flame licking her skin, or Saint Teresa of Avila, who wrote of being pierced by an angel in a moment so intense she nearly fainted. Scholars still debate how metaphorical those passages really were. You ask the nun if she's ever felt that. She doesn't answer, but her eyes say enough. You sit on a low wall now, watching the last of the flagellants file into the chapel, their backs striped, their breaths shallow. One man kneels just outside the door and presses his forehead to the stone. He stays that way, unmoving, as if waiting for something to strike him down. But nothing comes, only silence. And silence, you realize, is the most complicated part of all this, because pain gives permission to feel something when pleasure is forbidden, when touch is shameful, when desire must be punished before it can be understood. You think of the woman's sketches. You think of the red lines across skin, drawn not in cruelty, but sometimes in yearning, and you wonder, is it still penance if the pain brings peace? In the garden beyond the chapel, you find a wooden cross wrapped in ivy, not a crucifix, no figure nailed to it, just the shape, neutral, waiting. Someone has tied ribbons to the base, white, blue, a pale pink one with writing you can barely read, greater than I wanted to love without punishment. It's the only thing there, and somehow, the most honest. You lie in the grass, eyes on the sky, and let the clouds pass over you like pages. A bell tolls once, then twice. The sound rolls over the hills, and you wonder how many people walked this path through punishment, through penance, searching not for forgiveness, but for permission to feel, to be flesh and not be hated for it. You close your eyes, and when the wind shifts, it smells faintly of iron, of lavender, of something human and holy and unbearably real. You've crossed forests, towns, and fields. Now you descend into shadow again, this time deeper, colder, and carved not by hands but by silence. A stone path winds downward into what was once a monastery, long abandoned, its roof collapsed, its windows shattered into glass-toothed grins. This is where the records live. You pass through the arched entry, weeds pushing up through the floor, and find shelves still standing, miraculously, lined with scrolls and books so dry they might crumble under breath. Alone, you don't touch them. Not yet, but you feel their weight. They're watching. Because here's where medieval sexuality becomes documentation, not stories, not rituals, not superstition, but law. You step into the scriptorium, and what you see carved into the walls nearly stops your breath. Etched illustrations, dozens of them faint but unmistakable. Bodhis, paired, grouped, twisted, some tender, some grotesque, some so anatomically confused they border on parody. But these weren't jokes. They were guides, not for pleasure, but for punishment. Because the church catalogued sin like an archivist, catalogs butterflies, pinning each transgression to the page, naming it, pricing it. Lust with your wife on holy days, 2 days of fasting. Lust with someone else's wife, 3 years of penance. Lust with a goat, don't ask, or do. A mainstream fact, by the 11th century. Penitential handbooks detailed hundreds of sexual crimes, and their corresponding penances. Some were oddly specific. If a man kisses a woman's breasts with desire, he shall fast for 3 days. Others bordered on absurdity. If a woman inserts a candle into herself for pleasure, 6 months penance. Yes, that one's real. You sit down on a broken pew and glance at a loose sheet. The ink is faded, but legible. It's a confession, or maybe a record of one. It reads, greater than. She said she did it only on Fridays. She said she prayed after. She said the butter was salted. You blink. What does that mean? You don't ask. You just keep reading, because soon you see the pattern, not of sex, but of surveillance. They wanted to know everything. What you did, how often, with whom, whether you finished, whether you thought about it, whether you enjoyed it. Especially if you enjoyed it. You run your hand over a carved image, a man on his knees, head bowed. His confession scrolls above him in tiny script. Forgive me, Father, for I lay with my thoughts more often than I lay with my wife. The margins are filled with sketches of devils laughing. Some monks illustrated scenes not to warn others but to study temptation, obsessively, sensually. You turn a page and find an entire manuscript about nocturnal emissions, what caused them, what dreams preceded them, what prayers to say afterward. One fringe theory from a 14th century text, that eating too much cheese made a man more prone to lustful dreams, especially blue cheese. Historians still argue whether that was a sincere warning or the earliest known attempt at satire. You move deeper into the crypt beneath the chapel, where the truly forbidden texts were kept often chained to the shelves. Here, the margins grow stranger. more vivid. A naked nun rides a snail. A priest suckles from a wolf. A bishop is shown wearing nothing but a hat and a look of glee. You don't know whether to laugh or shudder, because even in suppression, desire finds a way out. Through ink, through image, through whispered stories no one was meant to read. You hear a sound pages fluttering, but the air is still. You realize it's the sound of your own thoughts now, unspooling like a scroll. Because for every rule written here, someone must have broken it. For every punishment listed, someone must have endured it. And maybe someone just wrote it down, not as shame, but as memory. You find one last book, smaller than the rest, bound in faded red leather, the title long worn away. Inside are verses, not scripture, not psalm, something else, greater than I touched her wrist, and the moon turned red. I kissed his neck, and the saints fell silent. I lay with joy, and feared not hell. It's unsigned, unclaimed, hidden beneath pages of dry doctrine. But it survived, and that matters. You step out of the ruins, blinking in the sunlight. Dust clings to your clothes. Something in your chest feels heavier and freer, because now you know what they tried to control. How precisely, how passionately, how often they failed. Sex wasn't just scandal in the Middle Ages. It was scripture, or at least, it tried to be. A map of the soul inked in fear, but read with curiosity. Painstakingly catalogued, obsessively feared, endlessly and you wonder if they had spent less time punishing it. Might they have understood it? Might they have loved better? Might they have lived freer? You turn once more to the etched stone behind you. It simply says, greater than he confessed to love. And that was the worst sin of all. Then the wind comes, and the dust settles again. But you remember, and you walk on. The air grows colder as you climb. You've left the ruins behind now, and the path winds upward, toward higher ground. Exposed, ancient in a way that doesn't need ruins to feel sacred. The sky overhead is leaden, clouds drifting low, dragging their bellies across the distant hills, like tired animals. You're heading toward isolation, because not everyone in medieval Europe lived in towns or manors, or even villages. Some fled those places, chose or were forced to live beyond the reach of bells, bread, and neighbors' hermits, outcasts, others who didn't fit. And here, among these crags and caves, you meet the solitary ones. The first is a man wrapped in rough wool, skin darkened by sun and wind, hair matted into coils. He doesn't speak, just watches you from the edge of a ridge, then turns and vanishes into a narrow cave slit like smoke. You follow at a distance, careful not to intrude. Inside, you find signs of life, a pile of furs, a gourd, scratched symbols, on the walls spirals, moons, and a figure with exaggerated hips and breasts, arms raised high, a goddess, a demon. You don't ask, because these people were never interested in your questions. You step outside again and hear chanting low, rhythmic, half-sung. You follow it and find a woman this time, cloaked in feathers and beads, spinning slowly in place, eyes closed. Around her neck hangs a rosary. Around her waist, a belt of bones. Contradictions don't seem to bother her. She sees you finally and stops spinning. She offers no greeting, just says, "You're late." You sit with her for a while, listening. She speaks of solitude, of clarity, of how the body becomes louder when the world is quiet, of urges that don't vanish, but shift shape into visions, hunger, dreams. The body doesn't forget, she says, even when you try to erase it. And suddenly you understand something that never quite made sense before. Celibacy isn't emptiness, it's an edge, a sharpening, a tension stretched so tight it sings. And for some, that vibration is holy, a mainstream fact. Monks and nuns across medieval Europe took vows of chastity, often from adolescence. For some, it was sacrifice. For others, refuge, a way to avoid dangerous marriages, a place to study, to heal, to disappear. But not all remained obedient. You hear rumors, even up here, of secret liaisons between cloistered lovers, hidden passages between abbeys and convents, lovers who communicated through prayer books, slipping notes between pages. One tale speaks of a nun who carved a tunnel beneath the herb garden to meet her lover, another nun. It was discovered when the floor gave way beneath a statue of Saint Cecilia. Fringe knowledge. In 14th century Germany, a cloistered mystic was found with an illuminated manuscript containing poems about divine love and physical longing. Scholars still argue whether she wrote them herself or copied them from an earlier source. You descend a little now, down a ledge where a cave opens into a wide, half-hidden plateau. It's covered in carvings, dozens, hundreds, symbols, phrases, names. One section shows bodies entwined, stylized but unmistakable. Another shows a woman alone, hands over her chest, mouth open, not in terror. You trace one inscription with your fingertip, greater than here, untouched. I touched everything. No signature, no date. But you feel her presence as if she were standing beside you. There's a myth you overhear from a passing shepherd, that up in these hills lived a woman who never aged, who seduced men in dreams, who gave birth to shadows. Some called her a witch, some a prophet, some a saint. She might be real, or she might be what happens when people try to explain power they don't understand. You light a small fire in a crevice of rock and sit beside it, and as the flames dance, you think about how silence, in this place, isn't absence, it's concentration. Here, the body is studied, but not touched, desired, but not fulfilled, imagined, but not acted upon, and somehow, it still matters. You remember the woman spinning, her rosary and bone belt clicking in time. You remember the marks on the cave walls, the carved spiral breasts, the mouths painted open, as if in mid-song or mid-sigh, and you realize solitude doesn't erase sexuality, it reveals it, filtered, focused, made mythic. You walk a little farther and find a stone hut tucked beneath an overhang. Inside, etched into the wall, is a single phrase, greater than I chose the mountain, because the world had too many hands. You close your eyes. You understand now, perhaps better than before, how sex in medieval Europe wasn't always carnal. Sometimes it was spiritual, sometimes symbolic, sometimes it was just the hum under the skin, the dream in the chest, the thing unspoken that still shaped every silence, even up here, especially up here. And when the wind comes, it doesn't whip, it whispers. You descend the mountain slowly, the path winding like a ribbon unraveling from the hem of a forgotten robe. The wind dies down, the trees grow thicker, the world softens again into grass and branch and birdsong. But something in the air feels different, now charged, as if the land itself remembers. And then you smell it. Incense, rich, resinous, sweet, and bitter at once. Frankincense, myrrh, and something darker, oak bark, maybe. You follow the trail, and soon the trees part to reveal a cloistered garden, perfectly circular. Stones set at the compass points. A well in the center. A group of women kneels in the grass, cloaked in gray, chanting. You've found them, the anchoresses, or at least, the ones who trained to become so. They aren't nuns. Not exactly. They're not quite mystics either. These are women who chose or were chosen to live in isolation. Often walled into small rooms called anchor holds, built against church walls. There, they'd spend their lives in contemplation, prayer, and paradoxically, a deep intimacy with the world. You watch one of the women rise from the group and walk barefoot across the garden to a stone bench. She opens a book hand-coped, richly illustrated. On the page, an image of the Virgin Mary, but not demure. Her eyes are wide. Her hand is on her chest. Her robe is slipping. The woman runs her fingers across the image as if to wake it. You sit beside her. She doesn't flinch. People think we're cut off, she says softly, that we're untouched. But we're not untouched. We're reshaped. She explains that some anchorites, despite their physical isolation, cultivated rich inner worlds, visions, dreams, even conversations with the divine that could feel sensual, emotional, sometimes disturbingly embodied. He comes to me in light, she says, and I feel him, in my throat, in my spine. I cry when he leaves. You wonder, but don't ask, if she means God or someone else. A mainstream fact, the 13th century English mystic, Julian of Norwich, spent decades enclosed in an anchor hold. Her writings describe intense encounters with Christ, some filled with tenderness, others with what modern readers might interpret as erotic metaphor. She called one vision the sensuality of God, and no one burned her for it. Because love of the divine was allowed to be passionate, as long as the object of passion was holy. But here's where it blurs. You're shown another book, this one hidden beneath a folded cloth. It's not a scripture. It's a set of letters between two women, dated, detailed. They speak of dreams of hands slipping beneath wool, of mouths pressed in darkness, of prayers that began with Our Father and ended in gasping silence. You look up. The woman watching you does not look away. These were anchorites, too, she says, each with a window facing the same chapel, each hearing the other's voice in the morning, each forbidden to ever touch. You ask if they did anyway. She smiles faintly. They found other ways. A fringe belief persisted in some regions, that when the body was denied, the soul found new pathways. That certain forms of devotion, prolonged fasting, ecstatic prayer, repetition of holy names could awaken something physical, even sensual. Not sinful, they argued, just fervent. Historians still argue whether this was sublimation or sublimely honest. You glance around the garden. Small statues dot the perimeter. Saints, mostly. But some unlabeled, half-eroded, round-hipped, open-palmed, possibly pagan, possibly wishful thinking. One depicts two women embracing, no faces, just stone mouths, pressed together. The woman beside you traces the lines with a piece of chalk. They built what they couldn't say. She shows you her cell now, a small chamber attached to the back of the church. One window faces the altar, another opens to the street, where villagers once came to ask advice or beg prayers. The third is bricked up, on purpose. Inside, the space is barely large enough to stretch out. A wooden cross, a cot, a bench, a candle, and carved into the wall, almost invisible in the shadow, greater than my hands still remember. You sit there for a while, imagining what it would be, like to stay, to never touch again, to never be touched, but to feel everything amplified, echoing, holy and human, and wordless. You finally ask, why choose this? The answer isn't dramatic, because it gave me a place where no man could own me, no priest could send me, no father could marry me off. I chose my walls. You think of that phrase, I chose my walls, and you realize how radical that is, because in medieval Europe, most women didn't get to choose, not their bodies, not their paths, not their lovers, not even their silence. But herein, a space smaller than a closet, a woman wrote her own story, with her hands, with her chalk, with her refusal to disappear. You leave the garden quietly, the incense lingering in your hair. The chants fade behind you, but something about the silence they leave behind feels different. Now not emptier, fuller. You pass a low stone etched with a single word, greater than remembered, and you whisper it to yourself, like a vow. Because those women weren't just secluded, they were seen. You're back on the road now, feet sore, heart heavy, head brimming with echoes. The sky has shifted again, muted lavender, bleeding into dusk. A breeze stirs the trees as you pass beneath them, and somewhere overhead, A nightjar calls once, then twice. You realize it's nearly evening again, and that means one thing. The taverns are waking up. You follow the smoke and laughter to a low building with a thatched roof and crooked chimney. Outside, horses doze, chickens scratch under benches, and a piper tunes a reedy flute near the doorway. Inside, warmth, noise, ale, the scent of wood smoke, and sweat, and roasting onions. But this isn't just a drinking hole. It's something older, wilder, messier, a brothel. Not exactly. A sanctuary. Maybe. A gathering place for the forgotten, the forbidden, the in-between. A tall woman greets you at the door, broad-shouldered, bright-tied, wrapped in layers of velvet and fur. She kisses your cheek without asking. Her fingers are ink-stained, her boots muddy. "Welcome to the library," she says, and cackles. You glance around. There are no books, but the stories are everywhere. At one table, a merchant shares his lap with a boy in pearl earrings. At another, a woman with a shaved head draws tarot cards for two soldiers, neither of whom seem interested. In war, in the corner, a man sings a ballad about a nun who ran off with a bishop's wife. It's not mockery, it's mythology, and every person here knows the rules of the outside world, and has decided, for tonight, to ignore them. You sit beside a quiet-looking scribe, scribbling symbols onto a napkin. He notices you and leans over. "Did you know," he says, "that in Florence, there were so many cases of men arrested for same-sex activity that the government had to open a second prison?" A mainstream fact. In parts of medieval Europe, especially urban centers like Florence and London, records exist of men being charged, fined, or imprisoned for sodomy. But enforcement was inconsistent, and subcultures persisted sometimes openly. The office of the knight in Florence arrested hundreds in the 15th century, but scholars suspect many trials were driven by politics or extortion. You raise an eyebrow. The scribe smiles. "Still happened," he shrugs, "but didn't stop us." You learn that people like him, scribes, apprentices, even clerics, formed coded networks. They had signals, a ring on the right hand, a red ribbon on market days. The phrase asterisk, "Are you a friend of Saint Sebastian?" Asterisk whispered like a secret handshake. Saint Sebastian pierced by arrows, beautiful in suffering, became an unofficial symbol in certain circles. Androgynous, vulnerable, visible. You think of all the art, the illuminated manuscripts, the oddly sensual depictions of male saints. How many of them were worship? And how many, longing? A woman slides beside you. Her dress is patched, her fingers inked. She's been listening. "They think we didn't exist," she says. "Women like me," she tells you about the sworn sisters, women who pledged their lives to each other in spiritual or domestic unions. Not always sexual, not always romantic, but sometimes, unmistakably both. Fringe documentation from 14th century France describes asterisk affirmant legal contracts where two women lived together, shared property, and were recognized by local authorities as a household. Modern scholars debate their exact nature, but in some cases, the language mirrors marriage vows. "You won't find us in history," the woman says, "but you'll find our debts, our wills, our graves side by side." You ask her if she regrets the hiding. She smiles. "I regret nothing, but I do get tired." And then she stands, claps twice, and the music begins. A dance breaks out, wild, barefoot, breathless. Men twirl men. Women lift women. There are no rules. Or rather, the rules have been rewritten, if only for the length of one song. You watch a knight remove his armor, piece by piece, joining the revelers in only a tunic and laughter. You watch a nun loosen her coif and swing her braid. Like a flag, you watch as the tavern becomes something sacred, not despite the chaos. Because of it, a place where love isn't dissected, punished, or hidden. where gender is costume, where identity is performance, but also power, where shame never made it past the door. You sit by the hearth now, the flames crackle. A woman strums a lute, singing something soft and slow in Occitan. A man beside her rests his head on another's shoulder. A child snores beneath the table. Someone pours you a drink. You sip. It tastes like honey and clove, and something a little dangerous. And you think this is what survival looks like, not just in hiding, but in celebration, in refusal, in audacity, and yes, in love. You ask the bartender, a burly ex-monk with a pierced ear, how long this place has existed. He shrugs. Long as people needed it. And he pours another round. You leave eventually, of course. The night's grown deep. The stars hang low. But as you walk away, you hear one last voice call out, "We were always here." Even when the world said we weren't, and you believe it, you carry the sound with you. You carry the stories. Because in the shadow of cathedrals and castles, beneath the robes and rituals, beyond the scrolls and scars, people simply were. Loving, longing, laughing, and for one flickering moment, unafraid. The road is quiet again. You've left behind the warmth of the tavern, the echoes of laughter still dancing in your ears like candlelight in a chapel. Now, the night has settled deep and wide, stars blinking overhead like distant secrets. The wind has picked up, but it's soft, almost curious. It brushes your cheek like a question, and ahead, a flicker of firelight. Not wild, like the bonfires of Beltane, not welcoming like the hearths you've passed. This one is smaller, controlled, measured. You approach and find a man, seated cross-legged beside it. His robes are simple, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes fixed on the flame. He looks up as you arrive. "I was wondering when you'd come." No fear, no surprise, just waiting. He gestures for you to sit. You. The ground is warm near the fire, the grass singed, the air thick with the scent of cedar and ash. "You've seen a lot," he says. You nod. He pokes at the coals, and sparks leap upward like tiny spirits. "Tell me," he asks, "have you come across the ones who paid for pleasure?" You hesitate. Because yes, of course you have. You've just avoided saying it directly. Prostitution. He smiles gently. People pretend it didn't exist, he says. Or they make it a punchline. But it was there, always, in the alleys, in the inns, at the edge of every cathedral. You listen. Because now, it's time to hear their stories. A mainstream fact. Prostitution in medieval Europe was not only widespread, was often regulated. In many cities, brothels were licensed by the church or the state. Some towns even assigned guards to protect the women. Taxes were collected. Rules were posted. In certain quarters, being a sex worker meant protection from vagrancy laws. In others, it meant punishment without trial. You think of a record from 14th century London, a woman named Alice fined for selling the use of her body in the shadow of a church wall. Her client, a priest. The irony. Not lost on anyone, the man by the fire continues. They were called many things, he says. Camp followers, whores, courtesans, alewives, playwives. Some were poor girls sold by desperate families. Others were clever women who used their earnings to buy freedom. Some fell in love. Some never had a name. You picture them, standing in doorways, veils pulled low, sitting at windows, hair braided with red ribbons to signal availability. In some places, they wore bells. In others, yellow sashes. Each town had its code. A fringe practice from Prague involved confession tokens, a wooden chip handed out by clergy. If a prostitute confessed her sins, she was allowed to work, legally for a period of time without harassment. Historians still debate whether it was forgiveness or just a business license. The man hands you a scrap of parchment from a leather pouch. It's a list: bread, soap, 2 ribbons, ink, candle, lye, Sav. You look up. Her name was Marjorie, he says. She worked on Candle Lane. She taught other girls too. Read, kept a ledger, took Sundays off. People said she was fallen, but she never once bowed her head. He laughs softly. She made more in a week than the town bailiff. You let the parchment rest in your lap, careful not to tear it, because it's evidence, not of sin, of survival. You remember now the woman at the tavern who whispered stories of two girls sharing a cot above a butcher's stall. You remember the carved initials on the tree, the handprints on the cave wall, the bricked-up window where voices still carried. Sex in medieval Europe wasn't hidden. It was compartmentalized, structured, managed, but never gone. Even the church knew this. Some cities placed brothels right outside the cathedral gates, arguing that it kept lustful urges from tempting the pious, a kind of moral pressure valve, like confession with less kneeling. But there were lines. Some women were accused of tempting clergy. Others were burned for witchcraft. The line between midwife and seductress often drawn by fear. A girl could be adored in one town, whipped in another. Everything depended on who was watching. The man leans closer now. There's a ledger buried in a monastery, he says. In it are the names of women who worked the southern port. Each name is followed by a note. Some say honest, some say brought a sailor to repentance, some say gone missing. He doesn't explain what that last one means. You both understand. You stare into the fire. And in the flames, you imagine them, those women, those girls, those clever, quiet souls who made a life from ashes, who learned to hide bruises with rouge, to smile when they wanted to scream, to turn pleasure into power when the world gave them no other path. Historians still argue how much choice they had, but you know this. They mattered, not for what they did, but for what they endured, for who they taught, for what they wrote, for the way they lived, even when the world tried to define them by the doors they stood behind. The man reaches into the embers and pulls out a small charred token, a wooden heart, barely larger than a coin, blackened by time, but still whole. She carved it, he says, with a hairpin, left it under her pillow. He presses it into your palm, and you feel the heat of 1,000 untold stories still glowing inside it. You thank him, he only nods. As you stand to go, he says one last thing. The oldest profession. No, the oldest punishment. The oldest survival. The oldest truth. You walk away, the fire flickering behind you, the token still warm in your hand. You wake to birdsong. Not the distant, cautious chirps of early dawn, but the full chorus, bright and shameless, echoing across the fields like a hymn with no God and no need for one. The sun is rising, low and golden, and the road stretches out ahead of you like a ribbon dipped in fire. You've come far, through cities and caves, convents and corridors, through beds and benches, prayers and punishments, through whispers and records and ruins and laughter. And now one last stop, the graveyard. But not just any graveyard. You follow the hill up past a crumbling chapel, beyond a grove of belah trees, until you reach it. A circle of stones so old the inscriptions have faded into moss. Only a few markings remain, rough etchings of hearts, of moons, of two interlocking hands. No crosses, no saints. This wasn't consecrated ground. This was refused ground. The place where people were buried when the church wouldn't claim them. Heretics, sinners, lovers. You kneel at one stone, barely visible beneath the grass. A single phrase still remains, greater than she chose her name. No birth date, no end. You brush the moss away gently, as if it were hair, and then you notice something remarkable. The graves aren't arranged in rows. They spiral outward, a soft geometry of resistance, like the petals of an opening flower. Not linear, not final, ongoing. You sit there in the middle of it all, and think about what it means to choose your name, to choose your body, to choose your love. Because for so many in medieval Europe, none of those choices were permitted. You were what your father named you, what the church declared you, what your husband bought, what your neighbors assumed, and yet people still claimed themselves. Secretly, softly, stubbornly, they carved it into tree bark. They wrote it in hidden books. They whispered it into mouths not meant to touch. They passed it down like recipes. They kept it alive through rumor. They remembered, a mainstream fact. Despite the heavy moral codes and severe punishments of medieval law, individuals found ways to express identity through clothing, patronage, songs, body modification, even naming rituals passed between lovers or covens. Not all identities had names back then, but they had meaning. And meaning, it turns out, is harder to kill than flesh. You lie down in the grass, the grave markers rising like islands around you, and you remember the virgin queens and androgynous saints, the lovers who touched behind stone walls, the men who wore ribbons, and the women who carved runes, the anchorites who dreamed in longing, the mystics who bled with joy, the prostitutes who kept ledgers in secret, the nuns who kissed beneath candlelight, the scribes who drew truth in margins, the flagellants who sought God through pain, the heretics who asked the wrong questions, the survivors who made pleasure a form of prayer, and you, sitting now in their memory, in their final, unclaimed sanctuary, a place the church forgot, but the earth did not. A fringe report once noted that some gravestones bore symbols not found in any clerical record: spirals, triple moons, crossed arrows, and open palms, which marks, some said, others believed, they were codes. But historians still argue whether these graves belonged to outcasts or to those who simply refused shame. You hear footsteps. A woman in dark wool walks up the path, carrying a bundle of herbs. She nods to you, places the bundle on one of the stones, and says, "He asked to be buried facing east, toward the sea." You ask why? She smiles. Because he never got to sail, but he loved a sailor. You nod. She leaves. You remain a little longer, watching how the wind braids through the grass. You run your fingers over another stone. It's cracked, but someone's tried to mend it, strapped it with iron, nailed the base into place. Whoever lay beneath it mattered to someone. That's all any of us want, isn't it? To matter, to not be erased, to be remembered not just for what we did, but for what we felt, what we longed for, what we tried to hold on to, even when the world told us to let go. And you realize something. This wasn't a journey through scandal. This was a map of human desire, of how it bent and flexed and burned and blossomed, even when walled in by guilt and silence. Because no matter the century, no matter the punishment, desire finds form, sometimes whispered, sometimes written, sometimes buried beneath moss, but always, always there. The light is softer now. Everything grass, stone, breath feels wrapped in gauze. Even the wind has quieted, drifting in lazy circles like it, too, is ready to rest. The sun lowers behind the hills, gold bleeding into violet. The air smells of old leaves, warm soil, distant lavender. And so, we slow. You lie back in the grass of that forgotten graveyard, arms folded beneath your head, staring up at the bruised sky. Every sound fades into hush. A bird's last call, the creak of a faraway branch, the faint ticking of your own heartbeat. You've seen so much, heard so many voices, stepped into shadowed spaces few ever talk about. You've walked through the doors of monasteries and brothels, into secret cells and crowded taverns. You've pressed your hand to cave walls, turned the pages of books never meant to survive. Read the confessions of strangers who longed and sinned and survived just as you do now, and through it all what lingered. Not shame, not fear, but tenderness. Even in the strangest customs, the harshest laws, the cruelest silences, you found moments of softness, of humanity, of someone daring to say, "I'm still here. I want I dream, I love. You watch as the stars appear one by one, little silver witnesses to the centuries. You remember the woman who chose to be walled in to choose solitude instead of servitude. You remember the lovers buried side by side with no priest to bless them. You remember the dancer with ink on her fingers and a story in her laugh. You remember the man who carved his memory into a wooden token and left it behind for someone, maybe you, to find. You breathe deeply now. Let your bones go heavy. Because this is where the journey ends, not in a grand palace, not beneath stained glass, but here, among weeds and whispers and the ghosts of the unrecorded. And still, it's beautiful. You realize something in this final moment. History doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears linen and dirt and a crooked smile. Sometimes it kneels. Sometimes it hides. But it always speaks if you know how to listen. And tonight, you've listened. You've opened the door, stepped in, and stayed a while. And now, as your eyes close and your body softens into sleep, you carry their stories with you, not as burdens, but as lanterns. Tiny flickers of light in the dark. You've wandered far. Friend, now rest. Let the wind fold you in. Let the earth hold your weight. Let their memories cradle you like lullabies. The story pauses here, but it never really ends. Sweet dreams.